You notice you're breathtaking.
This is an ABC News special report. The United States versus Timothy McVeigh. The jury reaches a verdict.
Good afternoon, I'm Forrest Sawyer in New York. You may have heard by now that the jurors in the Oklahoma City bombing trial of Timothy McVeigh have indicated that they have reached a verdict. They notified the judge just about an hour ago that after 4 days of deliberation, a total of some 23.5 hours, they had reached a verdict. They are scheduled to be returning to the courtroom where the verdicts will be announced in a minute or two, something like that. Now, the prosecuting team and the defense have already arrived, and they were somber as they came in. There you see Joseph Hartzler, who heads up the civil and criminal divisions of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago. Stephen Jones, the attorney who was representing Timothy McVeigh. He has handled more than 20 death penalty cases, as this may well be. He has lost only one. All of them have now arrived in the courtroom. Jeffrey Toobin, our legal analyst, has been tracking this trial from its very beginning and is with us now. There are a total, Jeff, of some 11 counts, 3 of which are distinct from the others. Walk us through this.
Well, the charges in this case are really actually pretty simple. The first 3 are conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, that is, a bomb. The second count is use of a weapon of mass destruction. Count 3 is destruction by explosive. Now, the jury will reach its verdict on those 3 first. And if the answer is guilty on any of those 3, or all of them, the jury will be asked to answer 2 questions.
And the point of those 2 questions would be?
They operate as a trigger for the death penalty phase of the case. In these 2 questions, if the answer is yes to both of them, the case will proceed to a penalty phase for the jury to determine whether Timothy McVeigh is to be sentenced to die. After those first 3 counts, there are 8 counts of first-degree murder consisting of charges relating to 8 federal law enforcement officials who were present in the Murrah building when it was blown up and who died in the explosion. If there is a conviction under any of those 8, the case automatically proceeds to a penalty phase, and there are no additional questions required.
Forgive me, I think I cut you off. You were going to run through those 2 questions, Jeffrey.
Okay, the first question is...
We have the verdict. Forgive me, Jeffrey, we're going to have to stop. We have the verdict coming in the courtroom. It is going to be relayed to me by our Tom Schell, who is in the listening room just outside the courthouse, and you were not able to hear Tom Schell because the Judge Match, has been very careful in trying to make sure that no proceedings in the courtroom are broadcast whatsoever. So as we sit here, the verdict is coming back now. The first one, count 1, is conspiracy. That Timothy McVeigh conspired with Terry Nichols and others unknown to use a weapon of mass destruction, that is a truck bomb, against persons in this country and property owned by the U.S., that the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Guilty on count 1. We are told guilty on count 1. That is the conspiracy count. We move on to count number 2, which is use of a weapon of mass destruction. That is guilty as well. Count number 3, use of a weapon against the property of the United States. And that too is guilty. Now we move to the 2 questions, the 2 critical questions that will be a trigger to determine whether or not they may move to the death penalty phase at this point. The jury is determining whether they're going to answer these 2 questions. Did the crimes result in death of anyone listed in the indictment? Yes. And question number 2, were those deaths a foreseeable result of the crimes? That too is yes. At this point, the jury is moving on down to the 8 counts of first-degree murder. Now, of course, there were 168 counts of murder that you might say 168 people killed, but these were all federal agents, and for it to be tried in the federal courtroom, it must fit those terms. First, count 4, first-degree murder of Mickey Bryant Maroney, a special agent of the United States Secret Service. On all 8 counts, we are told guilty. For all 11 counts, Timothy McVeigh has been found guilty at this point. Jeffrey Toobin, help us. Where do we move here?
Well, what happens now is either tomorrow or Wednesday, Judge Match will convene what's called the penalty phase of the case, which will be a short hearing, probably no more than 3 days or so, where the prosecution will present what's called aggravating factors, explaining to the jury why it should impose the death penalty. These will consist primarily of what's called victim impact statements, and it will be a harrowing day in court because it will mean people will testify about what it meant to them that their loved ones died. People who were injured in the blast will testify about how this has impacted their lives. Now, the defense will be allowed to put on what's called mitigating evidence, and there we will hear from people who will implore the jury to spare McVeigh's life. We will hear probably from Tim McVeigh's father, from his sister, who was an important witness against him in the trial, and perhaps from people who served with McVeigh in the Army during the Gulf War, when McVeigh had a unquestionably very good record.
This is going to be a very difficult argument for the defense, I presume. It is hard to argue mitigating circumstances with 168 people killed in Oklahoma City.
There are some people who simply believe that the death penalty should never be imposed. However, jury selection in this case was designed to weed those people out. So if you believe in the death penalty, as all these jurors apparently do, it's very hard to imagine how this case would not call for it, but we'll have to see.
Jeffrey Toobin, stay with us if you will. We should remember that there were 168 people killed in the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. This case is very much about their lives. They have been changed forever. One of the family members of one of the victims, Marcia Kite, is with us. Her daughter was Frankie Merrill, who was just 23 years old. She was a Federal Credit Union employee. And am I right, Miss Kite, you have been in the courtroom every single day?
Every day but one.
You have to line up, I gather, very early to get there. You've listened to the verdicts, and I can tell that you're strongly affected by it.
Well, I mean, we've been living with this for over 25 months now, and there was a lot of anxiety. I mean, we felt confident they would come back with a verdict of guilty, but yes, it is an emotional day, and I'm glad to hear those words.
This is a difficult question, but does it provide any peace at all to you to have come to this conclusion?
Nothing can bring back my daughter. I'm glad they found him guilty, though, because it not only affected our lives, the ripple effect is still going on, and it really affected our country as a whole, our sense of security and safety. And this is going to send a powerful message that we're not going to tolerate this kind of behavior in the United States of America.
You know that we have all watched and we have listened to the words of the family members there in Oklahoma City and watched through this past 2 years as life has gone on for you. Do you think that this will put closure for Oklahoma City and allow people to move on with their lives and allow the dead to rest?
Well, hopefully the dead can rest. I don't know if this hole in my heart will ever be filled, even if he is sentenced to die. That hole in my heart, I think, will continue to be there for the rest of my life. I don't know if there's any such word for family members as closure.
You have a 2-year-old granddaughter.
Well, she's 4 now.
4 now. Morgan is her name. I know. How is she doing?
Well, she seems to be understanding on a cognitive level. We've tried to keep her away from as much of this as we can. She's too really young to comprehend, and we want her to be a child.
Jeffrey Toobin, let's go back to you. Thank you again, Ms. Kite, for talking to us, and I know this is a very, very difficult day for you, and I hope that the rest of the day is as peaceful as it can be for you. Jeffrey, we look now toward the next phase, and as the judge has presented this to them, as they have listened to the victims, at that point, the jury deliberates?
At that point, again, the jury will be asked 3 questions, 3 options. Do you find that the penalty should be death? Do you find that the penalty should be life without the possibility of parole? Or do you believe that the penalty should be some lesser offense authorized by law? In fact, the way the sentencing guidelines work, it is virtually certain that McVeigh will get, at a minimum, life without parole. But the real question for the jury to decide now, and it will move pretty quickly, like everything does in Judge Maitch's court, is whether Tim McVeigh will live or die.
You make an interesting point, Jeffrey. In fact, this trial moved incredibly quickly. There were, 18 days of testimony for the prosecution and some 25 days, I think, for the defense. Was that right?
Well, 3 days. It was about
3 days. Forgive me.
3 days. It was an enormously fast trial, and it was also a very good trial. I mean, I think many people who've most recent exposure to the American judicial system was the O.J. Simpson case. It is a shame that they didn't see this trial. It was a very distinguished performance by Judge Maitch. The prosecution was superb. The defense did an honorable job for their client. It was in an atmosphere of dignity and efficiency, and I think it reflected well on all participants.
You know that there were some observers who were responding with surprise that the jury had deliberated for a full, well, 3.5 days, 23.5 hours. You felt that this was business as usual.
This is really not that long a deliberation when you consider that there were 150 witnesses and several hundred exhibits. Also, I think, you know, if you look at the range of deliberations, in the Oliver North case, in which I was one of the prosecutors, the jury deliberated for 16 days. In the O.J. Simpson criminal case, the jury deliberated for 2 hours, and I think they took an enormous amount of criticism for their hasty work. I don't think we'll ever see a jury deliberate that quickly again in a high-profile case. 3 days seems like a reasonable but not an unduly long period of time to me.
Thank you, Jeffrey. We all of us remember the turmoil after the verdicts outside the O.J. Simpson case. This has not been greeted by that at all. But one man who has been following this case from its very beginning is Governor Frank Keating of Oklahoma. Governor Keating, you are there with us now. Can you hear me, sir?
I can, Forrest.
Yes, sir. We're just focusing up our camera now on you a little bit, but we'll be with you in just a moment and get a full focus. But talk with me if you will. I remember that day just after the bombing in 1995 when you and I were there and you were doing your best to try to keep the city at peace and to try to make some sense out of all of this. How now, 2 years later, do you feel? Governor Keating, I was asking you, how do you feel in reaction to the verdict? Well, as you see, we've lost our sound to Governor Keating. Can you hear me, sir? We have lost him, but let's go outside the courtroom as we're putting our line back together to Governor Keating. We'll be with him in just one moment. Valerie Williams was outside the courthouse. I was mentioning how so many people reacted to the O.J. Simpson verdict. We were all shocked and I think troubled by the reaction to that. Outside the courthouse, Valerie, how was it?
Well, as word had trickled out that the verdict was about to come in, hundreds of people from surrounding office buildings came and stood on the sidewalk surrounding the courthouse. Literally, it looked like a silent parade, and they stood there for probably 5 or 10 minutes waiting on the verdict. When it came in, it was unanimous. Everybody cheered and clapped. There was a sense of great relief that the verdict had finally come in and that Timothy McVeigh had been found guilty.
Now, of those people who are gathered around there, Valerie, many of them, I assume, are family members of the victims who have been following this trial from right there in Denver.
Well, that's true. A lot of them are family members of victims who could not get in because there is a limited amount of seating, but there are many more people out here than could possibly be members of victims' families. I mean, these are people who are interested in the trial, who have followed the trial, and are concerned about the outcome.
The mood just before this, when we watched on tape, as we did, the arrival of the prosecutor, the arrival of Stephen Jones, the defense attorney, that was a much more somber feeling.
Yeah, I think both sides were very somber. One of the interesting things about the way the prosecution came in is that prosecutors came in arm in arm. It was kind of like a show of solidarity, whereas Stephen Jones did not arrive with members of his defense team. Instead, he came in with his wife. Now, we've been told that after the proceedings in the courtroom that Joseph Hartzler, at least, will be making a statement on the steps of the courthouse.
Valerie Williams, just outside the courthouse there in Denver. And once again, in case you are just tuning in, we should mention that on all 11 counts, there are 3 counts of conspiracy, use of a weapon of mass destruction, destruction by explosion, and 8 counts of first-degree murder against Timothy McVeigh. On all 8 counts, he has been found by a jury of 7 men and 5 women to be guilty. And now the jury is going to move into the death penalty consideration phase, in which victims' family members will talk about their troubles and those who support the defense will talk about mitigating factors. Let's move now to Oklahoma City. Our Tom Foreman is there in Oklahoma City, and we all know this image of this fence that is there behind you. Tom, were people gathered there as the verdicts were being read?
Yes, there were, Forrest. There were probably a couple of hundred people here who gathered as they heard news of the verdict coming down. They came around these television sets here, and as the verdicts were read, a slight cheer went up from the crowd. A slight cheer in that almost immediately everybody subdued themselves. An awful lot of people here say that they have personally known loss and that this to them is a very serious business that they don't feel quite appropriate cheering about as such. They were nonetheless very happy. A number of the victims' families came by and spoke to us. They said that they are very pleased that justice has been done. Several of them said they're actually glad the jury took a fair amount of time to look at this, because they didn't want them rushing into a decision that, one, could be overturned, or that would have been an incorrect decision. An awful lot of people here have been speaking for several days now about a sense of fairness, about wanting to make sure that whoever is convicted is the right person. One woman even went so far as to say that she's actually quite sad now on this day, not only because of the tremendous loss of life here, but as she said it, for what the McVeigh family will now go through. She lost a family member, and she feels that this is another family that is part of the tragedy of what has happened here in Oklahoma City. Forrest?
It is interesting, Tom, listening to you talk that now 2 years after this crime, it was on April 19th, 1995, that so many people there in the city which suffered so much because of this have turned to reflection. For them, this was not a day for revenge, I'm hearing you say, but it was a time for consideration.
Yeah, an awful lot of people, it's almost startling that you don't really hear a lot of talk of revenge at all. A lot of people from the beginning, for several months here, have been saying we want justice to be served, we want the right thing to be done. Even people who felt in their hearts that Timothy McVeigh was guilty said that they would accept a jury's verdict if the jury said he was not guilty. In the same breath, they almost always said, and if he's not guilty, we expect the government to get busy finding who is guilty. Nonetheless, there was an awful lot of relief here, I think is the best word, not so much a spirit of revenge or satisfaction as much as just relief, because it's been a very long time, an awful lot of waiting, and people here time and again have said the word justice. They simply wanted justice, and today they feel like they got some.
Tom Foreman there at the fence in Oklahoma City. Tom, if you would just stay with us for a few moments. We believe that we have our technical difficulties worked out so that we can talk with Governor Frank Keating of Oklahoma. Can you hear me, Governor?
I can, Forrest. Hi, how are you?
I'm very well, sir. I was recalling when I first spoke with you that you and I were there together on that day after the bombing, and I was watching you work so hard to pull the city together and to move the investigation forward. Now, 2 years later, as you listen to this verdict, your reaction?
Well, I think all of us are between heartache, tears, and tears of joy. You have that tremendous feeling of splintered emotions. This searing agony is behind us. The justice part of it has begun. At least a big part of it now also is behind us. We're very anxious, obviously, to see what happens in the penalty phase. But the government presented its case brilliantly, emphatically. It was a very fine day for criminal justice in America. And I agree with what was said before. People in Oklahoma now think that we have our little slice of justice to go with our very large tragedy.
You know that everyone in the country pays attention to what happens there, has paid attention to the family members, because we feel that that this strike was against all of the country. Never before has there been such a crime by Americans against Americans. Have the people in Oklahoma City been able to move forward, or has this waiting for the trial and this resolution kept them in a kind of limbo?
I think, Forrest, it really depends on the individual. I think some people obviously held on to every fact, every detail, watched it very carefully. Others, a lot of friends of mine who lost families or friends, didn't want to think of the names of the people who were charged, wanted to get on with their lives and just hope that justice would come. And the city is rebuilding. We today began work turning the dirt for a new YMCA developmental center and daycare center in place of the one that was shattered in the blast. And we raised the money sufficient to put the 30 kids through college who lost both parents and the 170 children who lost one parent. And we continue to rebuild. So it really depends on the individual, but the city itself is healing. I just hope these families can, because this should never have happened to them. It was an outrage. It was an obscenity. And I'm just glad that at least a portion of the justice phase is over.
Well, you have a career that in the past with the FBI, and you followed very closely the FBI investigation. Finally, the investigation and the lab work that was done came to be very controversial. Were you troubled by that as you listened to it arise in the trial?
Well, yes, I was, because obviously I think all of us as Americans want to make sure that the federal and the state law enforcement community works, that the laboratories and the forensics and the professionals within each law enforcement agency, in fact, do their job in a highly competent fashion. So when it came out that the FBI lab had serious problems, certainly a lot of us were very concerned about that. But again, the prosecution team wired around that very effectively with other evidence, independent evidence. They did an excellent job. I certainly hope that the FBI corrects its errors so that we don't have the potential of heartbreak as we almost had in this case.
Governor Keating, we thank you very much for talking to us, sir, and you know that our thoughts are with all of the people of Oklahoma City.
Forrest, you're very kind, and thank you very much.
Jeffrey Toobin is with us, and Jeffrey, you were following the testimony and what Judge Mach allowed in the courtroom to be presented. There were some things that he disallowed.
That's true, and that undoubtedly will be one of the issues that Tim McVeigh's lawyers raise on appeal. He was not allowed to put in evidence purportedly suggesting an international connection to this crime. He was not allowed to put in all of the evidence regarding the FBI crime lab and its problems. I should say in the same breath, however, that these are routine issues on appeal. I think the issue that this is very likely an appeal-proof case, certainly on the issue of guilt. Death penalty we'll have to see. But those prohibitions that Judge Maitch invoked in the case are certainly going to be part of the grounds for appeal.
One critical testimony was from Michael Fortier and from his wife Laurie. They had cut a deal with the United States government. It appeared to me that Judge Maitch bent over backwards to instruct the jury that they could ignore that testimony if they so chose.
That's certainly true. Judge Maitch gave a very unusual instruction to the jury in terms of how strictly he asked them or demanded of them to look with skepticism at the testimony of the accomplices in this case. He told them even to take their drug use into consideration, something I've never heard in jury instructions before. So I think all of that means this case is very likely to be appeal-proof, in my view.
Jeffrey Toobin, once again I'm going to ask you to stand by. I should, of course, remind you of what I think we really all know, and that is that cameras and recording devices were not allowed in that courtroom. Judge Maitch was quite strict about that, and so only reporters who have been in there can recount what they have seen. Our Dean Reynolds was there listening as the jury brought back their verdict. He has stepped outside now so that he can talk with his dean. Just paint a picture for us of what you saw and heard.
Well, Forrest, it was extremely dramatic as Judge Maitch read the verdict. You could have heard a pin drop, to use a cliche, in that courtroom. He had admonished everyone in the court not to make any shows of emotion or cheering or anything of that nature. And as he read the verdict one by one, Timothy McVeigh sat with his hands like this, folded in front of his face. He never made any sound. He simply listened intently, watching Judge Maitch the entire time as he read through all of the 11 counts. There were at least two women jurors by my count, who were crying as the counts were read by the judge, occasionally glancing across the courtroom, directly across the courtroom at Timothy McVeigh, but he did not return their glances. Behind us in the courtroom, there were spectators, relatives of those from who were killed at Oklahoma City, who were crying, although trying to keep their emotions under control. McVeigh's lawyers, you could tell when you walked in that they sensed the news was bad. They were entirely, uniformly grim-faced. The prosecution table also betrayed no emotion, although they seemed far more relaxed. The judge then told the jury, he polled them one by one, each of them affirming their vote of guilty. And as they did so, McVeigh seemed to acknowledge each juror by nodding as they affirmed their vote. It was an extremely emotional moment, and now the judge has sent the jury away for the rest of the day. They will resume on the question of the penalty, the sentence in this case, on Wednesday morning. They will not be sequestered during that period of time. That will only take place when they are deciding the actual penalty. And I must last point out that McVeigh was seated at the table and seated directly next to the man, Richard Burr, his attorney, who is a specialist in death penalty appeals. So I thought that perhaps McVeigh and his whole defense team knew precisely what was coming.
Once again, if you were just joining us in the Oklahoma City bombing trial of Timothy McVeigh, the jury has found Timothy McVeigh guilty on all 11 counts. One count of a conspiracy, one count of a use of a weapon of mass destruction, one count of destruction by explosive, and 8 counts of first-degree murder of federal agents who were working at the time, and it must fit all of those criteria in order for it to be a federal murder trial. Tom Foreman, again, with us at the fence in Oklahoma City, and as you can imagine, there are so many people who are gathering there. Tom, who have you brought with you?
Forrest, I have Betty Norman here, who lost a grandmother and was working near here at the time, had some friends who were also injured by this, and Kathy Malcolm, who knew people who were injured in the blast. Betty, first of all, your reaction to all of this. This was the verdict you were looking for, or did you expect this?
I wanted it to be guilty. I was afraid there might be a hung jury. I was afraid there was a technicality, something that they wouldn't get a closure on this. And so I'm glad that it's a guilty verdict. I don't like things like this to happen to anybody, but I'm glad it came out the way it did.
An awful lot of people here have spoken about just a sense of wanting the right thing to be done, not so much a sense of revenge or anger at Tim McVeigh. Can you explain that?
We've all gone through so much. You get to a point where it's not that you want to see anybody else hurt, but you don't want this to ever happen again. And at this point, I think our judicial system has come through with a lot of hard work. I know it had to be terrible for that judge. He's had a lot of pressure on him. But we need for people to know they can't do this to us. They can't do this to us as people. They can't do this to us as a nation. And they're never going to hurt us like this again.
What would you like the jurors to know?
I'd like the jurors to know that I really feel for them. I wouldn't want to have to sit in judgment of anybody, even as terrible as this. And I think they've done an excellent job.
Okay. Thank you for your time. That was Betty Norman, who lost her grandmother in this, and Kathy Malcolm. Kathy Malcolm, you had some friends who were also hurt in all of this.
Yes. You know, it doesn't matter if you had relatives, if you had friends. It touched everyone. It was everyone. Bless your heart. Thank you. Bless your heart too, because it hurts everybody. When something like this happens, it hurts everybody.
Well, thank you both. We appreciate your time. Forrest, there's an awful lot of similar talk around here from people who have been very touched by what happened here, very touched by the verdict, and who feel more than anything an enormous sense of relief.
Tom Foreman there at the fence, and I thank you, Tom. That sense of emotion, I think, is something that all of us feel, if not nearly so intensely, because they have lost their own loved ones. But we, I hope, can have some sharing in the pain that they have had. Once again, Dean Reynolds, who is outside the courthouse, and for the jury, which has had this awful responsibility, Dean, it is not over yet. They take a little bit of time off, and then they are back on Wednesday.
That's right. They're back Wednesday morning to begin this penalty phase, which is really like another trial. There'll be witnesses called by the prosecution, witnesses called by the defense, and then they will be sequestered to decide whether Timothy McVeigh is to be executed or whether he will get life in prison without parole. Those are the two choices facing them. Judge Maitch called it a solemn responsibility that has been given to you to decide this next question.
Dean Reynolds, thank you very much. Of course, the jurors will be listening to the family members as they talk about the difficulties that they have had. They will be listening to mitigating factors presented by the defense. Once again, Timothy McVeigh has been found guilty on all 11 counts by the jurors, who now move on to the death penalty phase. Continuing coverage of this will be provided via the web if you tune into ABCNEWS.com. ABC News World News Tonight, of course, will have complete details that coming up after your local news tonight. For now, I'm Forrest Sawyer in New York. We will see you on World News Tonight.
For continuing coverage of this story, stay with ABC News and abcnews.com on the web and AOL. This has been a special report from ABC News.
This is ABC.